Isabel Donovan stood at the threshold of her inheritance, gazing at the old Victorian mansion before her. The air was thick with anticipation, and a strange, uneasy chill crept up her spine as she adjusted the collar of her coat. She had always been the pragmatic type, never one to give much thought to the fantastical or the supernatural, yet something about the house beckoned to her. A pull she couldn't quite explain. Her life up until now had been predictable, grounded in the concrete realities of the world. She was a lawyer in her late 30s, successful but deeply unsatisfied. She had spent most of her adult years burying herself in work, burying her emotions too, to escape the ache of loneliness that gnawed at her heart. Her parents had passed away several years ago, leaving her with only a handful of memories, and a house she had never even visited. Now, standing in front of that very house, her inheritance. It felt like the world was shifting beneath her feet. The house itself seemed to breathe, almost alive with secrets, its creaking windows and rotting wood whispering tales of forgotten times. The dark, cloud-strewn sky above cast an eerie light on the mansion's towering spires, making it seem more like a creature of nightmares than a piece of property. Isabel's inheritance had come at a peculiar time in her life. She had just finished a grueling case that had drained her, leaving her feeling empty, as if she were merely going through the motions of life. When the letter arrived, informing her of her inheritance, she had dismissed it at first, assuming it was a mistake. But then the legal papers came, and they couldn't be ignored. The house had been left to her by her late uncle, a man she barely knew, whose eccentricities were the stuff of family legend. It had always been said that her uncle had a penchant for the odd and the unexplained. He had never married, had no children, and spent most of his life in seclusion, occasionally sending cryptic postcards that mentioned strange happenings and unseen visitors. Despite her skepticism, Isabel couldn't shake the feeling that her uncle's passing wasn't as simple as it seemed. Why had he left her the house? What was the real reason behind his seclusion? The unanswered questions gnawed at her as she approached the front door, the sound of her heels clicking sharply on the gravel driveway. She had never been one to entertain superstitions or tales of hauntings. Her logical, methodical mind had always dismissed such things as nothing more than stories to scare children. But now, as she stood before this imposing mansion, a strange sense of foreboding clouded her thoughts. The house wasn't just old. It felt alive, as though something waited within its walls, watching her every move. As Isabel stepped inside, the heavy door groaned on its hinges, revealing the dim, musty interior. The hallway stretched long before her, the dim light from the chandelier casting eerie shadows on the walls. Dust motes danced in the air, disturbed by her presence, but there was something else, something unexplainable, hovering in the atmosphere. The air felt thick, as though it had been untouched for years. She felt a sudden chill, as though the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for something. "Hello?" Isabel called, her voice echoing eerily in the silence. The only response was the distant sound of creaking floorboards above her, followed by an unnerving, soft whisper that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Her heart raced, and she hesitated for a moment before continuing down the hallway, her footsteps slow and deliberate. She had come this far. She couldn't turn back now, could she? But with each step she took, the weight of the house's strange presence pressed on her, like a suffocating hand against her chest. The wallpaper was peeling in places, the floorboards uneven beneath her feet, yet there was something undeniably fascinating about the place. There was history here, centuries of stories woven into the fabric of the house, stories that she had yet to uncover. As she wandered further into the mansion, she was drawn to a peculiar door at the far end of the hallway, its surface adorned with intricate carvings that seemed almost too detailed to be the work of mere craftsmen. She reached out and touched the door, her fingers tracing the patterns that seemed to pulse under her touch. The air in the room beyond this door felt different, colder, as though it were holding its breath, just as the house had been when she entered. Isabel's fingers hovered over the handle, uncertainty rising within her. She had no idea what lay behind that door, but she felt an overwhelming urge to open it, as if the house itself were calling her. She turned the handle, and the door creaked open, revealing a darkened room that smelled of aged wood and something faintly metallic. But it wasn't the room that startled her. It was the whisper that followed her in, a low murmur that seemed to come from every corner of the room. She froze. The voice wasn't clear, but it was unmistakably there. A faint whispering, as if someone, or something, was speaking just out of reach. Isabel's heart pounded in her chest as the whispering grew louder, the words now almost intelligible. It was a language she didn't recognize, an eerie, otherworldly sound that chilled her to the bone. She took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. What had she walked into? What was this house really hiding? The dim light flickered above her, casting strange shadows across the walls, and for a moment, Isabel thought she saw figures moving at the edges of her vision. She blinked and they were gone. "It's just your imagination," she told herself, trying to calm her racing heart. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. There was something far more sinister at play here, something far more real. As she stepped back, the door slammed shut behind her with a force that made her jump. Isabel spun around, her breath ragged, her mind racing. What was happening? What was this place? And what had her uncle been trying to tell her before his death? She didn't know, but she was certain of one thing. This house was no ordinary inheritance. There was something ancient here, something alive. And Isabel had just scratched the surface. Isabel had spent the rest of the afternoon wandering through the vast mansion, her curiosity battling with the unsettling atmosphere that seemed to grow heavier with every step she took. The whispering voices had faded, but a lingering sense of unease clung to her like a second skin. She had explored every room she could find, dusty drawing rooms, gloomy corridors, and chambers filled with forgotten furniture covered in white sheets. Each room was as cold as the next, as if the house itself was devoid of life, waiting for something, or someone, to awaken it. "I want to leave," she said, standing in the middle of the room. She returned to the grand hallway, feeling the weight of silence pressing in on her from every direction. Her mind kept replaying the strange whispers she had heard earlier, and a nagging thought persisted at the back of her mind. What if it wasn't just her imagination? What if something was really here? Isabel had no answers. All she had was a vague, growing sense that there was something far more than just an old, decrepit house behind the walls. Something was hidden in the shadows. The question that lingered in her thoughts was what? Her phone buzzed suddenly, breaking her out of the thick fog of contemplation. Startled, she fumbled for it in her coat pocket, her hands shaking slightly. She unlocked the screen to see a message from her childhood friend, Lucy. "Hey, just checking in. How's the house? Any ghosts yet? Or is it all just old floorboards and dust? Call me when you can." Isabel chuckled, a little uneasily, and quickly typed back a reply, her fingers moving faster than they usually did. "It's an experience. I'll tell you more later." She paused, her thoughts swirling, then added, I don't think it's just dust." She stared at the message before putting the phone back into her pocket, her eyes scanning the hallway again. The house, for all its dust and decay, felt alive, as though something was watching her. A loud crash echoed from upstairs, so sudden and sharp that it made her jump. Isabel froze, her heart pounding in her chest. It wasn't the sound of something falling. This was different. It was as if something had violently been knocked over. A chair? A table? She hesitated for a moment, then, despite the chill creeping up her spine, she began walking toward the staircase. Her hand rested on the cold iron railing, and her footsteps, hesitant at first, grew more resolute as she climbed the stairs. When she arrived at the front door, she was filled with aphasia of remorse. The noise had come from the upper floor, but now there was only silence. The kind of silence that filled the space between each breath, suffocating and heavy. Isabel reached the top of the stairs and stopped, her eyes scanning the hallway before her. The air felt unnervingly thick here. Something was off. Her breath was shallow as she crept forward, the floorboards groaning under her weight. Every step felt like a challenge to her resolve, her mind trying to convince her to turn back, but her legs carried her forward anyway. She had to know what was happening. She reached the door at the end of the hallway, the one with the strange carvings on it. Her pulse quickened. Was this where the noise had come from? Was this where the house was hiding its secrets? She slowly turned the handle and pushed the door open. Inside, the room was pitch dark. A dense, suffocating darkness that seemed to cling to everything, even the air. Isabel stepped inside, her heart racing, her breath shallow. She reached for the light switch on the wall, but before she could even touch it, the door slammed shut behind her with an ear-splitting bang. "Shit!" Isabel gasped, her voice echoing in the confined space. Her hands flew to the door handle, but it was locked from the outside. Panic set in as she yanked at the door, her pulse pounding in her ears. She hammered on the wood with her fists, screaming for help, but the only response was the oppressive silence that filled the room. She turned, trying to gather her bearings in the pitch-black space. Was there anyone else here? Had something else triggered the sound she'd heard earlier? Her breath hitched as she strained her ears, listening for any signs of movement. A soft rustling came from the far corner of the room. Something shifting in the shadows. Hello? Isabel's voice was quiet, but it still seemed to reverberate in the stillness. No response. Her heart raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Was it possible someone else had come here? Someone who might be trapped, just like her? Or was it something else entirely? She took a few steps forward, her hands outstretched in front of her, hoping to find something, anything, that would help her understand what was going on. Suddenly, a cold, clammy hand brushed against hers, and Isabel's breath caught in her throat. "Who's there?" she demanded, spinning around. "What is this?" Her voice cracked, betraying the fear she was desperately trying to suppress. A voice, faint and distant, responded. Not human, yet unmistakably clear in its intent. It spoke, a low murmur that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves, yet it felt as if it were all around her. Leave this place before it is too late." Isabel recoiled, her mind spiraling. Was this a dream? Was she losing her mind? The voice spoke again, louder this time, and its words were chilling. "Lydiana Dusion, you do not belong here. You are not alone." The words echoed in her head, rattling her already frazzled nerves. Panic surged through her chest. She had no idea what was going on. The voice sounded so real, yet she couldn't see anyone. She pressed her back against the wall, desperate to regain control of the situation. Trying to push away the memories, but not quite succeeding, she turned to... Then, another sound reached her ears, something far more tangible. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate, as though someone, or something, was drawing closer. "No!" Isabel's heart pounded harder, her stomach tightening in fear. She wasn't alone, but when the footsteps reached her, they didn't stop. Instead, they moved through the room, as if circling her. The temperature dropped drastically, and a wave of dread washed over her. Her skin tingled with cold. She wanted to scream, to run. But she stood frozen in place. The voice came again, now almost a whisper, but as sharp as a knife, cutting through her thoughts. "Come closer and you will see all of us." The walls seemed to close in on her, and Isabel felt the crushing weight of the unknown settle over her. She was trapped, and she had no idea how to escape the growing terror that surrounded her. In that moment, Isabel realized the truth. This house was no ordinary inheritance. It was a prison. A prison that housed far more than just memories. Something had been waiting for her. Something ancient. Something from beyond the veil of the living. Isabel shivered, and now it wanted her to stay. Forever. Isabel's heart pounded in her chest as the footsteps circled her in the darkness. The cold air around her seemed to freeze her bones, each breath a visible puff in the eerie, suffocating atmosphere. The voice continued to whisper, though she could no longer tell if it was a figment of her imagination or a real presence in the room. "Do you understand now?" The voice hissed, its tone both mocking and malicious. "The house has waited for you." Isabel's mind raced, but she forced herself to focus. She was trapped. There was no way out. The door was locked, and she had no idea who or what was behind the voice that taunted her. She took a step back, her foot catching on something soft, and she stumbled. More noise hung across the air, and she stumbled. Suddenly, a chilling laugh echoed from somewhere in the room, sending a sharp tremor through her entire body. "What's the matter? Scared?" The voice grew louder, as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. Miranda hesitated, turned and ran for the door. "No, I'm not scared," Isabel muttered, more to herself than to the voice. She wasn't about to let this whatever it was break her. She had faced adversity before. She had endured difficult cases, stood her ground in courtrooms filled with ruthless opponents. But this was unlike anything she had ever encountered. She took another step backward, her hands brushing against the cold stone wall. There had to be a way out. She had to find it. Just as she began to feel the weight of hopelessness settle in, the voice stopped. The room fell completely silent, and the footsteps ceased. Isabel dared not move, her senses on high alert. Something was coming. She could feel it, and then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. Figure. Hazy at first, like a shadow against the dark. Materialized in the far corner of the room. It moved slowly, its form indistinct and shifting like smoke. It was as though it were made of the very shadows that clung to the walls. A creature that existed between the real and the unreal. Isabel gasped, stepping back. But the figure moved closer. It was tall, taller than any person she had ever seen. And though its features remained unclear, she could feel its gaze upon her. She shuddered, feeling the presence of something ancient, something that had been waiting for her, just as the voice had said. "You?" Isabel began, her voice trembling. "Who are you?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised one long, spindly arm and pointed toward the far side of the room, where a narrow doorway had suddenly appeared. Isabel blinked, disoriented. Had that always been there? Was it real? The doorframe seemed to pulse, as if alive, the edges shimmering like a mirage. Before she could question it further, the figure vanished into the air, as if dissolving back into the shadows. Isabel stood, frozen, her breath catching in her throat. Was it gone? What had just happened? She had no time to think about it. The doorway beckoned her. The light in the room flickered erratically, casting strange, elongated shadows on the walls. She couldn't stay here. She needed to get out. With shaking hands, she moved toward the doorway, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end as she passed through it. The hallway beyond was just as eerie, with walls that seemed to stretch and distort in the dim light. But there was something different here, something that felt alive. The air was thick with the scent of something damp and decaying, but beneath it there was an underlying presence, something ancient and otherworldly. As she continued down the hallway, Isabel noticed strange markings on the walls, symbols that seemed to shift and change as she looked at them. They were not like any language she knew, but they spoke to her, as if they were calling her name, beckoning her deeper into the mansion. But then she heard something. A sound, a low, guttural growl, coming from the shadows. Her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't alone. Not just the figure. Something else was here. Isabel's breath caught in her throat as the growl grew louder. Something was moving in the darkness ahead, something massive, its heavy footsteps reverberating through the walls. Her instinct screamed at her to run, but she couldn't. She needed to find out what was happening. She had come this far. She was in too deep. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, human but distorted. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes, wide and unblinking, gleamed with an unnatural light, and its mouth hung open in a grotesque grin. Isabel staggered back, her breath hitching in her throat. What are you?" she gasped, unable to tear her eyes away from the creature. The thing took a slow step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. "I am the Keeper," it rasped in a voice that sent a wave of nausea through Isabel's gut. "I guard the door, and you—" It stopped, tilting its head as though considering her. "You must choose." "Choose?" Isabel repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Choose what?" Rigid angle. The Keeper's grin stretched impossibly wide. "You will see soon enough." Isabel's mind raced. Choose? What did that mean? She had no time to think about it, for suddenly she heard the growl again, much closer now. She spun around, her heart nearly stopping in her chest as a monstrous shape lunged out of the shadows toward her. A creature, a beast, unlike anything she had ever seen, charged at her, its claws extended. It was large, with matted fur and glowing eyes that burned with an unnatural hunger. Isabel screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the creature's roar as it barreled toward her. She stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest. Suddenly, a figure appeared at her side. Isabel barely had time to register who or what it was, but the figure lunged forward, knocking the creature aside with surprising strength. The beast howled in pain, but the figure didn't pause. It turned to Isabel, its face hidden in the shadows. "Get out of here!" the figure shouted urgently, grabbing her arm. "Run!" Isabel's breath caught in her throat as she tried to comprehend what was happening. The figure was human, but there was something different about them, something otherworldly. But she didn't have time to question. She pulled away from the figure and ran, her legs moving as fast as they could carry her. Ben fled the woods, passing the road several times. Not willing to call back, she had no idea who this stranger was, but they had just saved her life, and for the first time since entering the house, Isabel allowed herself to hope. The figure shouted again, his voice urging her forward. "There's no time. The others are coming." Isabel ran faster, her body propelled by fear, the darkness behind her closing in. Isabel's legs burned with exhaustion as she raced through the dark, winding halls of the mansion. The figure, a stranger, yet somehow familiar, leading the way ahead of her. Behind them, the creature's growls echoed through the halls, growing louder, angrier. The house itself seemed to come alive with the noise, the walls shifting, the floors creaking, as if the entire mansion was trying to swallow them whole. "Keep moving!" the figure shouted, his voice harsh with urgency. Isabel didn't need to be told twice. Her heart hammered in her chest, but the fear and adrenaline coursing through her veins kept her going. She didn't know who this person was or why they were helping her, but for now, that didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was surviving. They reached the end of a long corridor where an old wooden door stood ajar. The figure didn't hesitate. He shoved the door open with a force that sent it slamming against the wall. Inside was a table, a stack, and a binocular-scaled trestle inside. The room was bathed in an eerie greenish glow. At first, Isabel thought it was some sort of light fixture. But as her eyes adjusted, she realized it was coming from the walls themselves. The air felt charged, humming with an unnatural energy. She shivered, a cold sweat beading on her forehead. This was no ordinary room. The figure turned to face her, his eyes filled with an intensity that made Isabel's blood run cold. "This is it," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling around them. "This is where you need to be." Isabel blinked, confused. "What do you mean? Where I need to be? What is this place?" The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a step forward and pressed his hand against the wall. A ripple ran through the air like a distortion in reality itself. The green glow intensified, and for a brief moment, Isabel thought she saw shapes, faint, almost translucent, moving just beneath the surface of the wall. "Choose," the figure said, his voice suddenly softer, as if the weight of what he was asking was finally sinking in. "You have to choose. This is where it ends." "Here, ends?" Isabel repeated, her voice rising in panic. "What do you mean? What am I supposed to choose?" The figure looked at her, his face shadowed by the dim light, but there was a tenderness in his eyes. "This house," he said slowly, "it isn't just a house. It's a portal, a door between worlds, between dimensions, and you—" His voice faltered for a moment, as if he wasn't sure whether he should say the next words aloud. "You've been chosen to guard it." "Guard it?" Isabel's voice cracked. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Why me? I don't know anything about this place, about any of this. I just inherited this house." Her breath hitched as she looked around, her mind spinning with confusion and fear. The walls seemed to close in around her, and for a moment she thought she might suffocate from the pressure. Pressure. So much. The figure stepped forward, his eyes intense as he placed a hand on her shoulder. "You were always meant to be here. Your bloodline, your family, has been connected to this house for generations. You were born to protect it, whether you knew it or not." The words hit Isabel like a punch to the gut. Protect the house? She didn't understand. How could this be her fate? She was just a woman from the city, trying to make a life for herself. She had never asked for this, never wanted any part of it, but the growls from the hallway, the monsters stalking just beyond the door, the shadows that moved on their own, they all told a different story. This wasn't just some old mansion. This was a battleground between worlds. And whether she was ready or not, it was her fight now. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her, and the creature from the shadows lunged into the room. It snarled, its massive form filling the doorway. Isabel felt the air grow thick with malice as the creature's glowing eyes locked onto hers. Without thinking, she backed away, instinctively moving toward the figure. "No!" the figure shouted, his voice sharp. "This is your battle now. You have the power." Isabel froze, confusion and fear battling within her. Power? She had no idea what he meant. She wasn't a fighter. She wasn't even equipped to deal with whatever this thing was, but the figure's words seemed to unlock something deep within her. A strange, forgotten feeling of determination. She could feel it now. A strange energy rising within her, a connection to the mansion that she had never noticed before. As the creature advanced, its claws scraping against the stone floor, Isabel's mind raced. She didn't know what to do, but instinct kicked in. The figure had said something about guarding the house, protecting it. She stepped forward, putting herself between the creature and the figure. The creature snarled, a growl vibrating the very air around them. It lunged at her, its claws slashing through the air. No, Isabel thought. Not today. A flash of light erupted from her hands, a surge of energy that was both hot and cold at once. The creature shrieked in pain as the light hit it, forcing it back. Isabel's eyes widened in shock. What was that? Her hands trembled as the power pulsed through her, each surge making her feel stronger, more alive. It was as if the mansion itself was empowering her, lending her its strength. The creature recoiled, growling in frustration, but Isabel didn't hesitate. She raised her hands again, focusing the energy that surged through her, directing it toward the beast. "Be gone!" she shouted, her voice echoing through the room. The light exploded outward, engulfing the creature in a brilliant flash. When the light faded, the creature was gone. Isabel stood there, panting, her body trembling from the intensity of the encounter. The room was silent now, save for the heavy sound of her own breathing. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She had done it. She had defeated it. The figure stepped forward, his eyes wide with both surprise and respect. "You did it?" Isabel turned to him, her voice shaky but resolute. What was that? What just happened?" "You are the guardian now," he said, his voice low and full of awe. "You have the power to protect this place, to keep the others from crossing over. And now, you've sealed the first of many." His eyes softened as he looked at her, a hint of gratitude in his gaze. "You are the key to the balance. You have the strength, Isabel." Isabel's heart raced as she finally understood. She wasn't just here by accident. She had a purpose. She had been chosen for this very moment. And though the fear still lingered in her chest, it was no longer a paralyzing fear. It was a fire, one that would drive her to protect this house, this portal, at any cost. The mansion, the creature, the shadows. They were just the beginning. And now, Isabel knew what she had to do. With a final, determined glance at the figure, she nodded. "I'm ready." And with that, the true battle began. Isabel stood in the stillness of the room, the faintest hum of energy still vibrating in the air. Her hands were still shaking from the intensity of the blast, and her heart pounded in her chest. The creature that had once towered over her was gone, dissolved into the light she had conjured. She couldn't believe it. I did it. The house, the mansion, this cursed place, had tested her, had forced her into a role she never asked for. But now, in the aftermath of that explosion of power, she felt an undeniable sense of victory. For the first time, she could breathe a little easier, but there was no time for celebration. The danger wasn't over. The mansion still felt alive, still thrummed with energy that she couldn't fully comprehend. She turned to the figure who had helped her, the mysterious man whose name she didn't know. He stood across the room, watching her with an expression of both reverence and something else. Something almost like fear. "You did it," he said again, his voice soft, his gaze never leaving her face. "I knew you had it in you." Isabel swallowed hard, trying to process what had just happened. "I don't know how," she admitted. "But whatever just happened, it worked." The figure nodded slowly. "You're the guardian now, Isabel. The power you wield comes from the mansion itself, from the dimensions it holds. That creature you faced, it was only the first of many. The rest will come. They won't stop. They won't turn." She felt a coldness creeping over her, but it wasn't from fear. It was the weight of the truth settling in. She wasn't just an innocent woman who inherited an old house. She was now a protector, a guardian, responsible for keeping the door to another world sealed. And that meant facing whatever horrors lurked behind it. "I don't know if I can do this," Isabel said, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I'm ready." The figure stepped forward, his eyes softening with understanding. "You'll never be truly ready. No one ever is. But the house chose you, Isabel, and you've proven yourself. You just have to trust in the power that's within you." Isabel closed her eyes, trying to steady her breath. It was all too much to absorb. But as she stood there in the eerie glow of the room, she realized something. She had no choice. She couldn't run from this responsibility, not anymore. There was a world at stake, and she was the only one who could protect it. "I'm not alone, am I?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The figure gave a small, reassuring smile. "No, you're not alone. I'll be here, helping you. The mansion's power flows through you now, but I'll guide you, teach you how to control it." Relief washed over her in a wave, but there was still an unease in the pit of her stomach. She had a guide now, but the road ahead would be fraught with challenges she couldn't yet imagine. The mansion was far more than a relic of the past. It was a living, breathing entity that tied her fate to its own. "Are you ready?" the figure asked, his voice low. Isabel nodded, her jaw clenched. She was ready. Ready to protect this house. Ready to fight whatever came next. And there was no one within 1,000 yards who... The mansion, once a prison of uncertainty, now felt like a strange kind of sanctuary to Isabel. The walls no longer loomed over her like a constant threat. The energy that had once felt like an oppressive weight had transformed into something that pulsed with purpose. Her purpose. Days passed as Isabel began to learn the depths of her newfound power. The figure, who she learned was named Erin, stayed by her side, showing her the hidden chambers of the mansion, teaching her how to summon and control the energy that flowed through the walls. She could feel the magic, the ancient presence that thrummed beneath her skin, growing stronger with each passing day. But as the mansion revealed its secrets, so too did the dangers lurking in its depths. Strange creatures, monsters, beings from other dimensions would appear without warning. Erin would explain that they were drawn to the mansion, to the portal that pulsed within its heart. Each time, Isabel would stand her ground, summoning the light and power she now wielded, watching as the creatures were banished back into the dark void from which they came. There were moments when Isabel's resolve faltered, when she couldn't shake the memory of the growling creature that had nearly torn her apart. There were nights when the shadows whispered her name, when the weight of the mansion's endless power made her question if she could handle it. But each time, Arin was there, reminding her that she was not alone in this fight. One evening, as Isabel stood at the edge of the balcony, looking out over the vast expanse of forest that surrounded the mansion, Erin joined her. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the sky was painted in hues of pink and orange, casting an almost ethereal glow over the landscape. "I never imagined I'd be here," Isabel said quietly, her eyes distant. "I never thought this would be my life." Arin gave a soft laugh. "None of us ever do. But life has a way of pulling us into places we never expected. The question is, what will you do with it?" She turned to him, her gaze steady. "I'll protect it. The mansion, the portal. Whatever comes next, I'll be ready." He nodded, a sense of pride in his eyes. "You've already proven that you are." Isabel didn't know what the future held. She didn't know what other creatures would try to cross through the portal, or how long she could hold the mansion's power at bay. But one thing was clear. She had found a new purpose, one that tied her to this ancient place. She wasn't just a woman who had inherited a house. She was a protector of worlds, a defender of the balance between them. As time went on, Isabel and Arin grew closer, their bond strengthening with each challenge they faced. They became a team, a force united by their shared responsibility. Though the mansion would always hold its mysteries and its dangers, Isabel no longer feared it. She had become one with it, its heart beating in rhythm with her own. The day came when the mansion grew quiet, as if holding its breath. Isabel stood in the center of the great hall, her hand raised, her senses attuned to the faint hum of energy beneath her feet. The time had come. Another being had arrived, one far more powerful than anything they had faced before. But Isabel was ready. She took a deep breath, her heart steady with the certainty of her purpose. She was not the same woman who had walked into this house months ago. She was no longer afraid. The mansion was hers to protect, and with Arin by her side, she would face whatever came next. She scooped up her net phone and tried to enter the mazes below. She saw a master coming toward her. Together, they stepped forward into the unknown, knowing that their bond, forged in the fires of the mansion's trials, would be enough to overcome whatever darkness awaited. "And what brings you, so dark as this valley?" asked Anal. The mansion, the portal, and Isabel's fate had all been sealed. But the journey, the real journey, had only just begun. The mansion stood silent beneath the rising moon, its silhouette dark and imposing against the starry sky. Isabel's footsteps echoed softly on the cold stone floor of the great hall as she paced slowly, her mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. The events that had unfolded within these walls, the creatures, the battles, the lessons learned, felt like they belonged to another life. But this was her life now. This house, these dimensions, this duty. It was her reality. The portal had quieted over the past few weeks. The creatures that once appeared without warning had been fewer and farther between, their presence no longer as threatening as it had once been. Isabel had grown into her role as the mansion's guardian, learning to harness the power coursing through her, learning to wield it with precision and control. And with each passing day, she became more attuned to the mansion, more aware of its strange, ancient rhythms. Yet as much as she had come to accept her role, the weight of it still lingered. She hadn't wanted this life. She had never imagined that a simple inheritance could turn her world upside down, and while the mansion had become home to her in many ways, it still felt like a prison at times. A beautiful, haunting prison. Tonight was different, though. "Isabel?" Erin's voice called from the doorway. He stepped into the room, his face illuminated by the flickering light of the candles. There was something in his expression, a quiet, resolute kind of calm, that made her pause. "It's time." She turned to face him, her heart racing. "Time for what?" "The last one," he said softly. "The final creature, the one that has been waiting." Isabel's breath caught in her throat. For all the power she had gathered, for all the victories they had claimed, she knew that this would be the true test. The final creature wasn't just another monster. It was something far more dangerous, something far more elusive. It had been lurking just beyond the mansion's walls, growing stronger, feeding on the energies of the portal. "Are you ready?" Aaron asked, his voice almost a whisper, but filled with the weight of everything they had been through. She nodded, her resolve hardening. "I have to be." The mansion's halls felt more alive than ever as they made their way toward the heart of the building, the place where the portal pulsed most strongly. The air was thick with the energy that surrounded them, humming with anticipation. Isabel's footsteps were steady, her breath slow and deliberate. She was ready. She had to be. This wasn't just about protecting the mansion. It was about reclaiming her life, about proving to herself that she was capable of this, of everything. They reached the chamber where the portal stood. A swirling vortex of shifting light, the gateway to countless worlds. It was an eerie sight, its colours constantly shifting, never the same. Isabel could feel it now, more strongly than ever before, as if the very fabric of the universe was stretching and bending with each passing second. The creature was waiting. A sudden, sharp screech broke the silence, followed by the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against stone. Isabel's heart raced, but she stood firm, her hands lighting up with the familiar glow of power. Aaron stepped back, his face tense but unwavering. "This is it," he murmured. "Don't hold back." With a deep breath, Isabel closed her eyes and extended her hands toward the swirling portal. She felt the energy of the mansion surge through her, rushing like a river, wild and untamed. She could see it now, the creature emerging from the shadows, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light, its form shifting in and out of reality. It was a creature of pure darkness, its very existence a contradiction, both here and not here, both real and unreal. The air crackled as the creature lunged toward her, its form disjointed, its growls deafening. But Isabel didn't flinch. She focused, gathering the power within her, pushing the energy outward with all her might. "Begone!" she shouted, her voice carrying through the room with a force she had never known she was capable of. Silent. Isabel stood in the center of the room, her body trembling from the force of the blast, her chest heaving with the effort. But the creature was gone. The portal's energy stabilized, its swirling light calming to a steady pulse. The mansion had been protected. She had done it. Aaron stepped forward, his gaze filled with something Isabel hadn't seen in him before. Pride. "You did it." Isabel could hardly believe it. The fight had been more intense than anything she had ever faced, but now, as the echo of the creature's presence faded into nothingness, she felt an overwhelming sense of relief. For the first time since inheriting the mansion, she felt like she could breathe. The danger had passed. The mansion was safe. And she had finally proven to herself that she could handle it. As Isabel and Aaron stood in the chamber, their victory sinking in, Isabel realized something else. This wasn't just about defeating creatures. It wasn't just about protecting a house or a portal. It was about finding her own strength. The power had always been within her. She just hadn't known it. She hadn't known that she could face fear head-on, that she could rise above it, that she could be the protector. In that moment, Isabel understood. She had inherited more than just a mansion. She had inherited the responsibility of guarding worlds, of maintaining a balance that spanned across dimensions. But more importantly, she had inherited the power to shape her own fate. Aaron stood beside her, his voice breaking through her thoughts. "You're not alone in this," he reminded her. "We'll face whatever comes together." She nodded, her heart lighter than it had been in months. Together. Now, Isabel's journey had begun with fear, uncertainty, and the weight of an inheritance she had never asked for. But through each challenge, each victory, she had grown. She had learned that strength wasn't something she had to find. It had always been inside her, waiting to be realized. She had learned that fear wasn't something to avoid, but something to confront and overcome. And, perhaps most importantly, she had learned that she didn't have to face the impossible alone. As the mansion stood in peaceful quiet, Isabel knew that she had found her purpose, and in doing so, she had found herself. She wasn't just a woman caught in the tides of fate. She was a guardian, a protector, a force in her own right, and with that, the mansion, the portal, and the vast worlds beyond it were hers to defend, for as long as she was able. The journey ahead would be long, and it would never be easy, but Isabel was ready for whatever came next. Her true adventure had only just begun.